So now that our model is roughed in and we've only been using our hands so far, I'm going to start employing the use of tools. So we're going to be using very simple tools. I'm only going to use 5 actually. I use these a lot when I'm doing polymer clay. It's just basically an almond shape on one side and a flat side on the other, but it's made of metal. I don't know exactly what these are normally used for, but they come usually in like a set of wax manipulating tools. So, I mean, you can call them, wax pushers, I suppose, but they'll usually come in a set of wax carving tools. I'll use a wire loop tool, so a rounded loop, 2 different sides. I'll use a fine wire tool with a handle here that can also act as a pusher. I'll also be using this here, which is a needle tool for some fine lines. And then I'll also be using a ribbon tool. I don't use these as much, but a lot of you might have some of these, so I'll just show the efficacy of this tool. However, before we even start to use any tools, I'm going to reconsider the pose. Now, this will happen a lot when you're working with armatures or you're still trying to figure out what the character is going to do. Right now, I've got this person in a fairly, let's just call it simplified, just regular stance here. I'm going to try to bring his arms together, and I could still do that because remember there's an armature underneath, and I haven't committed to any particular form just yet, which is why it's still all in clay pieces. So I think I'm going to bring the arms together down into the middle. So I'm going to start to move things around. Going to do a little bit of like a crossed fist, like so. And let's say I'm pretty happy with that, which I am. I'm going to start to refine it in a second here. And just know that you can always do this at any time. If there's a slight change you want to make, it doesn't even have to be this drastic. Where remember, it's just clay. You can move it around. If you're not satisfied, don't commit to something that you're not fully feeling, So let's say I like this a little bit more. And now I'm ready to start using some tools. So at first I'll be using pushing tools like this one and this one to really start to shape most of these areas, and I'll have a small little bit of clay with me just to add a little bit when I need to. Normally I use a lot of scraping tools and I subtract and I add and I subtract and I add, and that's normally how I use oil-based clay, but polymer clay doesn't lend itself well to doing that as much as, say, the monster clay does. So pushing clay around is mostly the way that you're going to start to refine shapes. Because of its gumminess, it doesn't really take, consistent shaving as well as other clays do. So I'm mostly using the rounded side, which as you can tell is giving me little marks, but those I can just consistently shave down and try to get it pretty consistent. I can also use the other side to rake. Or let's say I want to pinch the pectoralis inboard a little bit. I could use the rounded side rather the concave side here to really pinch this form in. Gonna add a little bit there. It's important while you do this not to wash away any landmarks that you've already established. So right here, this crease between the shoulder and the chest muscle, I don't want to lose that. So instead of just going across like this and just blurring it entirely, I'm going to let that crevice be what it wants to be here. So that's just like a little pinch. So it's still there, but it isn't as extreme, but it's also not utterly washed out. And you'll see me do this at various points throughout this refinement stage. So I just added a little bit here to match the fullness that I have established on this side. Then I'm going to blend that back. Same thing with the end here. Then I'm going to do what I just did over here by using the rounded concave side and alternating between the two. Just keep in mind, whatever tool you're using, when you press it, you're pressing the opposite of the shape that your tool is. Now I want to catch a little bit more highlight here to accentuate the rib cage that comes around before the abdominals begin. Then notice that this is a little further down than this over here. So I just got to add a little bit on this side and blend it upward. Now they're a little bit more equal. And now I'm just paying attention to the highlights and the shadows. So you see this shelf of highlights that I added up here? That's creating that shelf of the rib cage coming down before it becomes the abdominal muscles here. I'm going to extend that over to the obliques on the sides. Sometimes it helps to make like a little sheet and put it over some area that you've already established major landmarks. And then as that sheet lays, you could just blend it in like this. You get a smoother, more consistent surface. So this little transitionary area there, I'm going to do a very thin piece like this. Put it over that. And then I still keep that little transition, but it's not as abrupt. And this is a tool that I'll be using the majority of the time. Not because it's better, it's just that it does a lot of the jobs for me without me getting too distracted on small details. Like I can put a needle tool through here, but right now, since I'm not finished with any particular area, it doesn't matter that I get the cleanest line. And now I'd probably just continue in this vein for another 30, 40, maybe an hour, just using this tool, but we're going to kind of start moving on here. I'm going to do a little bit more on the face here, and then we'll start switching tools so you can see what they all do. So for this guy, instead of making him a specific character, I'm going to make him look like there's an even keel, even kind of like a surface put over the top of someone's face, but there are no discernible features. As if he was blurry. If you want specific features, there are plenty of other videos of me doing that, so I'm just doing something a little different here. So I'm going to employ that little, like, making a little sheet method to fill in the eyes. All the while, I'm making sure that I don't lose the features. Because even though my intention is to soften them, I don't want to obliterate them either. So I'm still having those shadows, those angles occur. I'm going to add a little bit here for the forearm muscles, just so that it matches a little bit more to this side. And now we'll begin to use some other tools here. So other than a pusher tool like this at the beginning, essentially what these are just smaller versions of your fingertips. So all that work we did with our hands at the beginning, now we switch to these so that we can be a little bit more deliberate, a little bit more intentional with each of our movements. Then after that, I'll usually go to a kind of like a blending mode where I'll use wire tools like this for that. So if I want to blend this a little bit more without losing those shadows, I'll use the flat part. You see how if I put the flat part here, see how it's pretty consistent? So I'm just going to very lightly roll this over, back and forth. So I'm going to go down this time. And I'm kind of pulling the clay across its own surface and softening up all those irregularities. So notice how there's still a deliberate break there, but I haven't done something like this where it's like completely obliterating it. So instead, I'm just going to be a little soft about it so that it looks like there's still quite a bit, like a layer of skin on top of the anatomy rather than deliberate, harsh line breaks. Same thing with here. I'm just going to go very softly over the top of it. This could also be used this way, where I'm using the flat of the tool to come across here and lay this surface that was like this down so I can catch more of that highlight from our light source. It could also be used to start to, let's say I wanted him to have a little bit more of a break for an ab here. I'll make that line, but I won't leave it as that because you see how now it's highlight, and then shadow again. Because whenever you cut into the sculpture, you're kind of creating like a valley that'll go like this. And then you need to relax these areas that you've just raised back into the form. See, as I'm coming across here, you see how there's like a very deliberate valley here? I'm going to pull that down. Then you can always switch back to your pushers. If it's like a larger area, you just want to move clay around. So you can go back and forth. It's not like I'll never go back to these. It just depends on what the intention is at any particular time. So it's the same thing with these wood tools. They basically do the same thing, but notice that the wood tools will leave behind a little bit of a texture because it'll scrab more irregularly, which is why most people that use use polymer clay, excuse me, they'll use either steel tools like this or these silicone pushers. Where I didn't mention these before in the intro, but they'll use this to kind of like move it around and make nice creases. I personally am not the biggest fan of silicone tools, but just so that you know that they exist. And they also have these rounded edges here. Sometimes people will use this too much to smooth out areas like here. Remember, the lesson of whatever tool you're using, it's going to leave behind the mark, the negative mark of whatever tool you're using. So always go with large tools for large areas that don't have irregularities, and only put in those irregularities after you've established the main parts. The next one is the ribbon tool. So this is more for like carving and shaping. So as I'm coming across here, I'm actually taking off material instead of just moving it around like I was with the loop tool. Ribbon tools have a way of just carving away at the surface. I don't like it that much because it seems to mar the surface up as well. I rather when I pull the clay across, see how it looks all raised, all those like white particulates that are up. Whereas when I use this, it kind of relaxes them down and they're a little bit shinier. And then all I got to do is go like this with my finger and all that goes away. See? And then these small loop tools, they do the same thing as the other wires. They're just smaller, so they can get into harder to reach areas like in here. Let's say I wanted to make a crease. I could. And I could just pull it across this way. And then you have needle tools that could be used to really finish off these crease areas. You could also use their sides. So let's say we were working on a particularly wrinkly individual. We can add little wrinkles like this. Now this doesn't make sense here, but I'm just doing it so you see what I mean. See? It's like all that's tucking in there. So let's say this was like really, really tight and we wanted to put a deliberate line. We could do that using a tool like this. We could also employ it this way where you use it on the side of the tool and then softening it as you go. So it's like harsh and then softens out. Another thing you can do with a needle tool is to take a piece of plastic. So this is from a set of cups that I bought. So it can be any piece of plastic so long as it's not super thin. So this has some heft to it. You could do the lines over the plastic, and the plastic will act as a buffer. So when you peel it away, those wrinkles are really subtle. Because if we were to do that same thing over here, see how harsh they are? And you might not want them to be so harsh. You might want them to be a little bit more of that subtlety. So I'm going to take these away here. They don't quite make sense there. And that's about it. It's just essentially what we've done in the last 20 minutes here, but for the next few hours. And in no time, you'll have a fully realized maquette. One more area to cover here is solvents. So for polymer clay, I've used Roncinol before. It's basically lighter fuel. You can get it at gas stations, CVS, any kind of convenience store will have something like this. I'm just going to go ahead and pour some in here. And then we're going to use some brushes to start brushing. But first, let's give ourselves something here to use solvents on. So we can have, let's say we want to make this area really smooth. So we can start to do it with our pushing tools and get it fairly smooth. So let's say we want something like that, right? Almost like let's say a big shoulder, right? And then let's say over here we want a few wrinkles. And then using that technique that I showed with the plastic, I'm going to put in some fine wrinkles over here. Okay, crisscross. These are kind of like the wrinkles on your fingers. So let's say those are our textures. So we have basically a smooth is what we want. We want this very, very smooth. Maybe let's add a few little dimples. And let's see what the solvent will do to areas like this. So Roncinol will have a little tip right here where you can either get it with your nail or you can just take a tool and flip this up. So it looks like this. Just a little bit. I wouldn't do too much. And instead of Roncinol, you could use, a nail polish remover. Even higher percentage alcohols will work. So if I go over the surface like this, you can already begin to see how it's softening up those little bumps. And it just smooths out that whole surface. Now you don't want to overdo it because what you're doing there is dissolving the surface. You see how that's very skin-like now? Same thing with these really, really rough ones. And then you let the chemical compounds kind of just evaporate into the air. I wouldn't touch it with your fingers at all. See that this fleshiness, which is really nice. You can do this all over like a creature's body, a dragon, or even some realistic skin. And there you go. You could do this basically all over your model. It's just once you do this, I would wait almost overnight or a few hours at least before you either continue manipulating it or you put it in the oven. I wouldn't do this if you're still figuring out your surface. Don't jump the gun. Wait until your sculpture is nearly complete to use this, because what you're doing here is you're breaking down the chemical compound of the surface of your clay, and then your clay just becomes a little bit more, let's call it powdery, and you're basically dissolving a little bit of the polymer in there. So you're weakening the clay. So only do this at the end when you're ready to commit to some of these lines and textures that you've already put on. This shouldn't be a substitute for what I call bad surface. So if it's super bumpy, get it closer with your pushing tools, your metal tools. Get it more consistent. You saw how we got this area to look more like a shoulder rather than like going from here. So let's say this area here, let's say I'm like, oh, I'm done here. I just don't want to work anymore. Well, you could go like this and really beat it up with the chemical compound. But when you're done, you're still going to be left with a very bumpy surface. It's going to be a smooth bumpy surface, but a bumpy surface nonetheless. So, see, don't cut the corners. Get it nice and consistent first, and then this will even out the rest. And let's say these bumps are still a little bit too harsh for you. You could just do one more layer. Same thing with these, although I think this looks quite nice. So it's just what you need. But basically, whatever you're hitting, you're going to dissolve it a little bit. It's basically going to even out as you go. So use it to your discretion based on what areas you need to be more or less textured. So I can probably keep going with this for, like I said, hours until it's where I want it to be. But instead, we're just going to move on to how we go ahead and bake this little gentleman here. And then you'll have a fully realized maquette. That way you have basically all the steps. If you want more of this kind of sculpting tool manipulation footage, there's plenty of other videos that you can access for that. I'll do a more long form character in polymer clay in the future. But let's get this in the oven so you can see what that process is like. So we're going to be using a standard kitchen oven here. We're going to hit bake and then go down to 275. Then after a few minutes, once it's preheated, it's already there, we're going to hit kitchen timer and we're going to set it to 22 minutes in my case. Now, you only want 15 minutes per quarter inch, but I'm going to hit 22 because I have some areas that are a little bit thicker than that. So we're going to place our sculpture in here. I'm going to put him pretty central. And now he's only going to be in there for the amount of time that I put it. Remember, you have wood in there, so you don't want to leave it for a few hours and forget about it. So make sure you have an alarm to go off, okay? And he's done. The wood's going to be hot. So just grab it like this. Find a place where you can leave it alone for a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and put down this little heat mat. Set him down. And I'm going to leave him there for a little while. Because once you bring him right out, when you bring your sculpture out of the oven, it's going to be a little bit flexible still. It needs to just fully cool down, and then the cure time is done. And then you can go ahead and paint it, modify it, add other elements to it, maybe some cloth, whatever it is that you want to add to it. You could even add a little bit more polymer clay using a little bit of polymer glue or just regular glue, and it'll stick on, and then you can bake it again. And those are essentially the basics of maquette modeling.